Hi, my name is Onel, and today I'll be going over some WebView functionality within the COVID-19 Tracker app, which is open source and just information related to COVID-19 health, data, news, and tweets. Before getting into the weeds of the actual application structure, let's take a view and see what this app can accomplish live. Upon loading the app, we see that it's broken up into 4 different tabs, which each tab representing a particular view for users. We see a tab for overall COVID-19 statistics, a tab for COVID-19 case data, a news aggregator that actually gives us any articles related to COVID-19, and finally, a Twitter stream, which, upon further inspection, allows us to be able to switch between different Twitter handles related to COVID-19. One thing I'm noticing is that across a number of these tab views, I'm seeing dynamic content that I can scroll through, which is obviously coming to us live. To do this, it might be easiest to actually just show us directly the websites that these pieces of content are coming from, but we need that to be embedded in some sort of web view for us to be able to take that information and show it to the user. To see how these web views work, we can look at the code and see where the developer is creating them. We can see that there are a number of controllers and models the developers have created for all the various functions currently within the app. I wanted to bring your attention to the COVID-19 tab controller, which we see is in charge of creating each of the 4 views by creating a tabbed view of a list of UI view controllers: data, cases, news, and Twitter navigation controllers. One special note is that each of these seems to be embedding a view controller within a navigation controller to allow each tab its own set of functionality within the view. Say, if one exists, a user being able to press a back button only within that tab. I want to pick one of these controllers and see how web views work. So let's go with the Twitter tab. Here we see that the tab is instantiated as a UI nav controller, and the Twitter view controller that we're creating is placed inside of it. Upon creating this view controller, it seems that it takes 2 arguments: a title, which will always be Twitter, and an object called usernames that has some associated content with it on the Twitter object. As we navigate back towards the project hierarchy, we do find a model called Twitter, and when looking at it, we see what looks like a class that holds all the COVID-19 Twitter handles encapsulated in a variable called content, and this is found again within the class structure called Twitter. Currently, we only see 2 possible streams, but let's take a look at the actual Twitter view controller to see what it will do with this information. Upon opening this particular view controller, we see that the developer is importing some necessary libraries, namely the WebKit framework that we see here, to create these WebView instances. In order for us to be able to understand how the developer was able to use this WebKit framework to create these instances, it would help for us to first take a look at the documentation for this functionality on Apple's own developer website. In taking a look at the documentation, we can see a description of the WebKit overall, and immediately see a link to the actual objects we, as developers, will be creating to add to our apps to seamlessly add web content to our views, the WK WebView object. In the docs for WK WebView, we can see an example implementation that can help us understand some of the basics of setting up a view with a WebView. Here we see a normal import of the WebKit followed by the instantiation of a UI view controller and a WK WebView object within that view controller. We then see some overrides of some of the typical iOS lifecycle methods that designate the steps for creating, loading, and showing the view we are creating on the screen. In particular, it looks like the WebView needs us to first set up the view as a WebView object by both setting the view controller as a delegate and adding what some basic configuration settings might be for the view itself through the web configuration argument. Once we've completed building the basic object in the load view step, we then override the view did load aspects of the view lifecycle to collect the actual content of the view by providing a URL in string format and making a request of that URL to obtain the web content there before loading that into the web view itself. Sounds pretty simple in setup, which is great. And if we scroll down further, we see some additional information. First, we see a description of the web view configuration method, and this sounds like it allows us to change web view defaults and settings. Upon looking for the docs for this, that idea is confirmed. We also see information about something called a navigation delegate. This allows us to granularly control the navigation behavior of the view on our screen, allowing us to navigate the app view like we would a normal web browser with the back, forward button, etc. Upon looking at the documentation, this too is confirmed as the functionality behind navigation delegate. Let's jump back in with this information in hand to see how this developer took WebKit to create their own views for COVID-19 information. We see that the developers decided to do something a little bit differently. Although they're still instantiated the WebView object as normal, it seems that they are writing some custom code to configure this actual WebView to their liking. Instead of going through the typical lifecycle methods, it looks like they wrote their own methods to be able to set up a view, load that view with specific configurations, and then make that web view appear on screen through some action that requires the page to refresh upon either the initial load or in subsequent loading. Upon looking further, it looks like a majority of these functions are written in the extension of the router controller itself, or in the extension through the WK navigation delegate method within the view controller as well. If we look at that first step with the setup, we find the function here. When the view is being initialized through the setup, we take in first the title, which is just a string, and then a user, which is also a string. We know from earlier that this must be one of the users that we have on our list within the Twitter model. In the setup, we also take the view of the view controller and set it to white. We give it a title, in this case it will always be Twitter. And then in the same setup, we also take this web view object and set the navigation delegate to the view controller itself. Because we're initializing the very first Twitter stream when we open up this app, we're actually calling for the first round on the very first username in the list of usernames in our Twitter model. For us, that'll be the bNodesk. Completing setup, our next step is to call the configure function as shown below. Here, we're taking the newly created web view and adding it as a sub-view of our main controller's view. Additionally, we're going to set some constraints using the NSLayout constraint method so that our web view actually is anchored to the top, bottom, left, and right of our main view. Next, we're adding some controls for refresh so that when we look at a Twitter feed, if we want to get the latest information, we can scroll down by holding and have it refresh, as you see in this image here. That functionality is added here when we add this refresh control to the scroll view. We are also creating the menu on the top right. In that menu, we create a button image using the ellipses system image. And for each of the children in that menu, we're adding a UI action. We're mapping for each of the buttons the user and the Twitter handles list with the title. And we're adding that and returning an action for each of the different options we have so that upon clicking any of these actions, we are told to refresh the web view with that user's information. In the case of this one, the CDC's information. This here just finalizes our UI by adding these buttons to our view. Just to be specific, here are the functions, one written in Objective-C so that the action button itself can take this information, and one for the actual core functionality where we are taking the user, their information, plugging into this other function for their content to create the content of that view before loading it using this load_html string method for the web view itself. Just to be clear again, if we scroll up for content for user, it's taking that Twitter handle and embedding it in the actual website information that we need to be able to use for the request later on. Although I've shown you the core of how the web view works in development, I wanted to offer some additional notes. In the extension for the navigation delegate, the developer customized what happens within the web view of someone's stream when there are active links in a tweet. Without going into too much detail, we see that upon clicking the link, we want the app to temporarily redirect to a browser version instead of within the web view itself. We have the ability to add a number of different rules for navigation within this view to the smallest detail, including even the animation that occurs when the new browser comes onto the screen. If we were to say change this animation to false, we would no longer see the slide in animation we saw earlier. It just appears on screen. We also see that the developer can also play around with functionality in a number of ways. So if we wanted to, currently we only see 2 options for Twitter feeds. Where can we change that? If we go back to Twitter, we can actually add a few more interesting Twitter feeds related to COVID-19. Say, for example, we live in Illinois, so I might want to also see something from the Illinois Department of Health And because I live in Chicago, I want to look at CDPH's, Chicago Department of Public Health's Twitter handle. Let's see what happens now. We have buttons added, and we can see our new Twitter feeds. Although I don't have much more time to fully explain how I do it, one other thing I might do if I were to contribute to this app is to add an ad feature for each of the different tabs so that we can add Twitter handles like we just did, or any other preferred news sources or particular countries or states in each of the different tabs. That's all I have for you today regarding the COVID-19 app. Thank you for your time.